Back to conference chat shortly, but we turn to another matter now. The BBC decided a little earlier this evening to reverse its decision on the Naga Munchetty complaint. Lord Hall, the BBC Director General, has told staff that the breakfast presenter's words were not sufficient to merit a partial uphold of the complaint against her, and that he had personally reviewed the decision of the complaints unit, reiterating that racism is racism and the BBC is not impartial on the topic. It followed an on-air ad-lib a little earlier in the year in which Naga had commented on a tweet by President Trump telling US Congresswomen of colour to go home. She described her own experiences of being told to go back where she came from, saying the phrase was rooted in racism. Now, on Friday night, we talked to comedian and BBC presenter Nish Kumar, who expressed his outrage at the original judgment.
For me, racism is an issue on which there is a right and wrong side. Racism to me is it's like gravity. You know, there is a position that is correct and there is a position that's incorrect. It's a subject along which people have laid down their lives in defense of the idea that racism is unacceptable. You know, people protest over it, people are killed in wars because of it. And so the idea that we would still treat it as a talking point is absolutely bizarre to me.
Nish Kumar. Well, Jim Waterson is The Guardian's media editor, and even before Tony Hall had reversed that decision, the story had changed. Jim, just talk us through what you discovered today.
Well, there's been a lot of anger within the BBC, and I've not had a story I've worked on recently where as many people have come forward, privately people you wouldn't expect, wanting to share their story and move this on. And what we got hold of was the original complaint, and the most powerful person in the UK media is this one anonymous member of the public who complained about Naga's original comments and managed to blow up this whole scandal as a result. And where the BBC and their editorial standards director David Jordan had gone on air and said the reason that her co-host Dan Walker wasn't also criticising our finding was because the complaint wasn't about him. And what we got hold of at The Guardian was the original complaints that had been sent in, which made very clear that it was about the two of them. And while that might sound a nuance, one of the real issues at the heart of this, and what has angered a lot of BBC journalists, is that they feel that women and people of colour within the BBC get treated differently to older male presenters who are given more free rein to do what they want. And the idea that in some way, and the BBC makes very clear that they feel that actually David Jordan didn't speak out of line, there was more to it, and that he wasn't actually lying when he said that because they have narrow things that they can consider. But the fact that originally someone wrote in and said, I don't like these two presenters, and only one of them got punished, and it was the woman and it was the person of colour, that is something that's really rankled a lot of BBC people. Do you have a sense now of what the reaction is tonight? This is a story that's gone way beyond what the original complaint was. This was a real tiny microscopic bit of an original complaint that they found that had breached the editorial guidelines. It was very, very thin. What's happened now is we've seen, one, that the BBC Director General is willing to overrule these decisions on impartiality when he feels that there's enough of a public outrage. Two, that BBC staff are increasingly willing to speak their mind. But most importantly, perhaps, that there is a breakdown in the entire idea of what the media should be, with older BBC executives defending the idea of a sort of patrician, authoritative, speaking as one voice organisation, and younger audiences and younger journalists expecting something with personality and ability to reflect on their own opinions within the news agenda. And that is a real clash of culture, and one that's very hard to reconcile, and just reflects the completely chaotic media atmosphere that we're in at the moment. It's really interesting. Jim, thanks very much indeed. Well, Michael Grade is a former chairman of the BBC and former executive chairman of ITV plc. He's now a Conservative peer and joins us by webcam. Was Lord Hall right to reverse the decision, Lord Grade?
Well, you're dealing with nuances of interpretations of guidelines. I have great respect for Tony. I'm sure he's much closer to it than I am. I actually agreed with David Jordan's original judgment, and this isn't about race, this is about impartiality. The BBC very clearly is against racism and will call out racism, and so it should at any time. What it can't do is cross the line into opinion about political figures like Donald Trump. And I think the two presenters did actually put a toe over that. Not more than a toe, but a toe over that line. And this is not about racism. It's not about sexism. It's about impartiality. And the BBC has to guard its impartiality vigorously, which I think David Jordan did.
When you hear that originally, in that original complaint, both presenters were chastised, by the viewer at least, but only one was ultimately chastised in the ruling, does that alter your perception of what happened here and whether race was to play?
No, there is a process at the BBC, as I understand it, and I may be wrong. When the complaint got to its third phase and got to David Jordan and the complaints unit, the editorial unit that looks to the final arbiter amongst the executive, the complaint was only about Naga Munchetty's comments. It wasn't about Dan Walker's comments. That's as I understand it. So the Guardian is right, but David Jordan is also right, because there is due process and you can only go by the letter of the complaint and the letter of the processes that the BBC has. It does show up a muddle inside the BBC, and one wonders whether Ofcom, who ultimately have locus in this, will actually have a look at this and be the final arbiters. But what's at stake here is not racism. Please, it isn't racism. It's the BBC's impartiality.
You talk about nuance and due process. Do you agree, perhaps, with Jim Waterston's comments that there is a culture clash between what younger viewers expect in terms of the personality and what older viewers expect to be upheld by the BBC? Do you accept that perhaps the original decision risked alienating many BBC viewers?
I don't care who it alienated. The BBC's impartiality is sacrosanct, and the BBC has to defend that. The day it concedes anything in the way of impartiality, it's the day. That's the end. Spells the end of BBC journalism. So if people want opinions, let them go to social media or Fox News. They certainly don't go to the BBC for that. And the BBC's impartiality is absolutely sacrosanct.
And if people of colour are saying that this is about racism, including some who work for the organisation, or that they feel that their voices have been stifled, would you still tell them that they are wrong?
No, I wouldn't, because I think they've misrepresented. There's been a lot of misrepresentation of the BBC's position. The BBC's position, very clearly stated, has been that the BBC stands against racism. That's not a matter of partiality or impartiality. The BBC is against racism. The point at issue here was whether either or both of the presenters on Breakfast Time crossed the line into opinion and crossed the line of impartiality. It's nothing to do with racism at all.
Michael Gray, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.